Hi, I'm Jo from J.H.Leather, and in this video I'm going to show you how to create these rolled leather handles. Let's get started. So the end pattern template for this project is going to be available as both a PDF pattern pack download and an acrylic template, and both can be purchased from my website jhleather.co.uk, or you can check the links in the description. So the materials that we're going to need are 4 1-inch metal squares. You're also going to need some 8mm belting for your filler, some reinforcement tape, and then the leather that I'm going to be using is bridal butt, and that is vegetable tanned. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut a 2-inch wide strip from my bridal butt, and then I'm going to split that down to 2.5mm thick. Once we've done that, we can square one end. And what I'm going to do is on the flesh side, draw around my pattern. And then I'm going to apply some of my reinforcement tape here. And the reason I'm putting that on this end only is because I want there to be lots of strength through the turn, which is going to hold our handle onto whatever we're making. Once you have applied your tape, you can then flip your strap back over and draw your end pattern template around on the end of your leather. And make sure you transfer the maker's marks. Once you have done that, you can then cut out this end. And we're then going to measure the overall length. Now for me, end to end, these handles are going to be 23 inches. And then you can repeat the steps we did earlier by drawing around our end template and reinforcing that area on the flesh side. You can then draw around your pattern on the grain side, remembering to add in those maker's marks. And then you can cut this out. And we want to have 2 handles in total. Now you can do your handles any length, but the ones that I am making, like I said, end to end cut out are 23 inches, which will make up to 20 inches when finished. Once we've got our 2 straps cut out like so, what we're going to do is do some finishing on these end turns. So what I'm going to do is use a very tiny 0 edge tool and just edge around that turn area. I'm then going to use a 1.5mm fixed creasing iron and just crease these ends as well, before going over them with some edge paint. Once we have done that on the ends of our straps, we can then go ahead and mark in for our stitch marking, and that is in between those maker's marks that we have drawn on previously. And my stitch line for these is 3mm in from the edge. Once you've got these lines marked on, you can use a pointed awl and just hit that all the way through your leather on those end points that we have marked on the pattern. And once you've marked those points in, we can use our stitch marker and stitch mark the ends. So what I'm going to do is make sure that my stitch marker, the first stitch mark, is the right distance away. So I'm going to measure it off of the hole, the circular hole that we have just put through, and then move my marker over and start my stitch marking there. And we're going to follow this line up until we get to the point on the other end of this line, and again we're going to have it so 1 stitch mark is short of that circular hole, and you can then repeat this on the remaining sides. And you want to make sure that you stitch mark these all the way through so that when we come to actually doing our stitching on this end, it makes things an awful lot easier. The next step is to measure out our filler. So what we're going to do is mark just in from where our stitch marks start on the inside flesh side of our handles. We're going to give that a little line there. And then we're also going to mark a centre line down the whole handle. This is going to help when gluing the filler in. With our fillet, we want to skive that down. So we're going to mark 1 inch or 25mm back from the end. And then we're going to skive that down to the same thickness as our fitting. So once you've marked that on, you can then use your knife and skive the filler down. And trim off any fluffy bits. And we can then mark the overall measurement. Now, this may be different for you if you have handles that are a different length. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to line that up with the marks we made earlier where our stitch marks are and lay the filler out and cut that to length. And we can then repeat the skiving on the other end. We're going to cut a pair of these. We're now ready to glue our filler in, so we're going to help pre-shape the leather. So you're going to fold your leather in half and just squeeze that together all the way down the centre line. And once you've done that, you can now apply your glue. Now, the glue I'm using is the EcoStick 1816B. And we're going to put that all the way along and down the centre of our handle. And then we can also put this on to our filler. We're going to put it on the side that we have skived first. Now you want to make sure that your glue is nice and tacky before you start sticking anything together. And so for me, rather than waiting, what I'm doing is actually using this hot air blower just to help the glue go tacky. Once your glue has gone tacky and is ready to stick together, you can stick your filler in down the centre of your handle using that centre line as a guide. Once you have glued in your filler, you can now apply glue to the rest of the handle. And you want to make sure you get this right up and around the filler so we get some nice rolled handles. Again, I'm going to be using this hot air blower to get the glue to go off a bit faster and get it nice and tacky. And then I can start sticking my edges together. So what I'm going to do first is actually make sure the very edges of my leather are nice and even. So I'm going to stick those together first down the length of the handle. And then using some flat-ended pliers, which I have applied some leather to make sure they don't damage my work, you can then squeeze the leather around the filler. Once I've done that, what I like to do is actually then fit this into a rounding block and use my bone folder to make sure the leather is really stuck nice and tight. And I like to do this on both sides, and this also is going to give me a nice guideline to use when I am doing my stitching. Now, if you haven't got one of those, you can layer up a couple layers of grey board and use that. And that also works really well. Now, sticking with our grey board as my little sort of step to help me with my stitching, we can now start to do our stitch marking along the edge of our handle. And we're going to stitch mark that all the way along. Now, I'm not going to be stitch marking this all the way through. So the two layers of the grey board here are going to help keep our handle nice and flat as we do our stitch marking. And when we get to the ends, and also when we start, we want to make sure that we do our first/last stitch hole so that it is an equal distance away from the last hole when we were stitch marking around the turns. So we are now ready to stitch, and the thread that I'm going to use is 0.55mm polyester thread. I'm going to take just over 1 full arm span for this so I can get the whole length of this handle stitched in one go. Now we are going to be doing our double hand stitching, and we're going to be starting with 2 back stitches to make sure we get the ends of our handle and the ends of our rolling nice and tight. Once you've done your 2 back stitches, you can then continue down the length of your handle and finish with 2.5 back stitches. Now, like I said, I didn't stitch mark my handle all the way through, and the reason for that is because it can be quite awkward to make sure that your pricking iron is going to be going through completely straight. So I'm going to be making my holes here with my awl. Once you've finished stitching the length of your handle, we can do some trimming. So what we're going to do is set our dividers so that the trimmed area is going to be all in line with the rest of the handle. Now for me, this came out at about 5mm or 3/16 of an inch. And I'm going to mark a line with my divider all the way down the length of my handle. And for this, I'm actually using a smaller cutting mat to help keep everything in line, because we're then going to cut all the way along that mark. And by using the cutting board like this, we're going to have a nice straight edge to our cut. Once you've trimmed off the excess of your handle, you can then sand this area down to make sure it is nice and even and level. Once we've done that, we are now ready to start to attach our fitting. So we're going to put our fitting on, and then we can put this in the clams. Now this does look a bit more awkward than it actually is in this video, because the clams that I was using were a bit awkward here, trying to keep them in the camera as well as doing all the stitching. So what we're going to do is, with our double hand saddle stitch method, we're going to start with 2 back stitches, and then we're going to do a stitch over the edge where we swap our needles over and go through the end hole one more time, and that's going to really cinch the leather in around our fitting. Once you've done your back stitch, you can then continue stitching all the way down to the point of your turn. Now, when we get to the point, what we're going to do is we're going to stitch right up to that normally, and then on the last stitch, our thread that's on the sort of lower side, as it were, or the side with our stitch marks on, we are going to push that all the way through the rolled part so it comes out on the other side of the handle. And it's also going to link all our stitches up so we don't have any gaps in our stitching. We can then flip our handle around, and what we're going to do is that needle that has just come through, we're now going to push it into the next hole along, and it's going to come out in the point on the other side of our turn. With the thread that's in the point on the inside of the turn, that is going to come out in that same hole where our thread has just gone through. And that's going to link all our stitching back up, and we can continue stitching the rest of this handle. Now, depending on what stitch mark size you use, you may need to do a hidden stitch because your stitch marks may not fully add up, and you might have an extra one on the sort of outer edge of your turn. Now, that is absolutely fine, and like I said, we can do a hidden stitch. So to do that with your side that you need to do the hidden stitch on, that comes through to the next hole along, but points back to one hole behind it. And there'll be more information on this in the information pack that comes with the patterns and the templates. Now, once you've got around that fiddly end bit of your stitching, you can continue right up until you get to your fitting, where you are going to perform your 1 stitch over the edge and 1.5 back stitches so that both ends of your handle match. And once we've done that, we can now start to do some finishing touches. So if you have any lumps or any excess leather around the end of your turn, you can skive them off now with your knife and get everything nice and level. And you can also go over this again here with some sandpaper if you feel you need to. Now, even though I am using edge paint, what I'm going to do is use my number 1, which is a 1mm wide edge tool, and I'm going to edge either side of that rolled just to make it so that it is nice and round and there are no sharp edges on that area of my handle. I'm then going to heat up my single crease. I'm going to smooth the fibres of my handle in one direction, and this is going to help me get a really nice smooth finish to my edge paint. Once your fibres have been smoothed down, what I like to do is actually tie the ends of my handle together as they're going to be once they're attached to the bag that I'm intending to use them on. Once you've tied the ends of your handle together, you can apply your edge finish to your handle. Now, like I said, I'm using edge paint for this, and to get a really good finish on your edge paint, what I like to do is actually build this up in layers. Now, you're only going to be seeing me do one in this video. However, what I actually do is once the paint has fully dried, I'm going to take some sandpaper and just buff the surface and make sure that it's nice and smooth. You can also smooth it down with a hot crease or use a combination of both of those processes, and then apply another layer of edge paint and keep doing this until you are happy with the results that you've got. And so that is how you create these rolled leather handles. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. And now if you did like the video, please give it a thumbs up to let YouTube know and help get this video out to more leather crafters. So that is it from me, and I shall see you in the next video.